260 wrecked tanks in one valley. Not scattered across the Golan Heights, not distributed among multiple sectors, concentrated in a single stretch of terrain between Tel Hermonit and Booster Ridge, maybe 3 kilometers end to end. Another 240 armored personnel carriers mixed in with the tank hulls, Soviet-built T-62s with their turrets blown off. T-55s burned black, some sitting where they died, others pushed sideways trying to retreat. The Israelis named it Emek Ha-Bacha, Valley of Tears. By October 9, 1973, you could walk from one end to the other stepping only on destroyed Syrian armor. An Israeli reconnaissance officer tried counting them on the morning of October 10th. He stopped at 200, gave up, reported more than we can process. The actual tally came later from aerial photographs and salvage teams. 260 tanks confirmed in the valley itself. Those numbers don't align with how armored warfare typically works. Tank battles spread across kilometers. Units maneuver, flank, disperse. Concentrated destruction like this requires something specific, a killing ground where one side kept attacking the same position and the other side kept shooting from prepared defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. The Syrian General Staff knew the valley existed. Their maps showed the terrain. Tel Hermonit, a 750-foot hill on the north side, Booster Ridge on the south. The low ground between them formed a natural corridor running roughly east-west. Any force trying to break through Israeli defenses in that sector had to cross that valley or detour 15 kilometers in either direction. Syrian commanders made the calculation. We have 1,400 tanks. They have 177. We can afford the losses. They were half right. Syria could absorb losing 500 armored vehicles in 4 days. What they couldn't absorb was failing to break through after losing 500 armored vehicles in 4 days. The Syrian 7th Infantry Division and elements of the 9th Infantry Division fed battalion after battalion into that valley between October 6th and October 9th. Each assault pushed closer. Each assault left more wrecks. By the 4th day, Syrian tank crews were maneuvering around their own destroyed vehicles from previous attacks. Gun camera footage from Israeli Centurion tanks shows T-62s using knocked-out Syrian armor as cover while advancing. At one point on October 8th, Syrian forces got within 30 yards of Israeli positions, close enough that Israeli tankers could see Syrian crew commanders through their sights. RPG teams knocked out several Centurions at that range. Syrian infantry reached the ridgeline in some sectors, but they never held it. Every penetration got pushed back by Israeli counterattacks or artillery, and every Syrian withdrawal left more tanks burning in the valley. The Israeli 7th Armored Brigade defending that sector started with around 100 Centurion tanks on October 6th. By October 9th, they were down to 7 operational vehicles. Syrian intelligence estimated the Israelis still had 40 to 50 tanks in the northern sector. That miscalculation, thinking they faced 50 tanks instead of 7, probably changed the outcome. When Syrian commanders finally withdrew on October 9th, they left behind not just destroyed vehicles, but a tactical lesson. Numerical superiority means nothing if you can't suppress defensive positions that know every range and firing angle to your approach routes. The 260 tanks in the valley represented roughly 18% of Syria's total armor, committed to the Golan offensive, all lost trying to break through one 3-kilometer section of ridgeline defended by a single understrength Israeli brigade. The briefing happened October 5, 1973, one day before the assault. Syrian 7th Infantry Division tank commanders gathered at forward positions near the Purple Line, Soviet advisors present, taking notes. The operations officer laid out numbers that made veteran tankers nod with confidence. Israeli strength on the Golan, 177 tanks total. 2 brigades spread across 70 kilometers of front. Artillery support, 11 batteries. The math was simple enough that company commanders calculated it themselves. Syria was committing 1,400 tanks to the offensive, 7-1 advantage in armor, 13-1 in artillery, with 140 batteries positioned along the border. General Omar Abrash, commanding the 7th Division, told his officers the breakthrough would happen in the northern sector. The 9th Division would hit simultaneously to the south. Israeli forces would fragment, reserves wouldn't arrive in time, and Syrian armor would control the Golan Heights within 48 hours. From there, roads led straight to the Sea of Galilee and northern Israel. Soviet advisors had calculated Israeli response time. Reserves needed 24 to 36 hours to mobilize and deploy. Syrian forces would be dug in on defensible terrain before significant Israeli reinforcements arrived. The plan assumed speed and overwhelming force in the initial assault. Tank crews received equipment the Israelis didn't have. Soviet-supplied night vision systems, infrared searchlights, and sights that turned darkness into tactical advantage. Israeli Centurions had xenon searchlights, but used them sparingly because they gave away positions. Syrian tankers could fight effectively at night, while Israelis struggled with limited visibility. The T-62 formed the spearhead. Newest Soviet export tank, 115mm smoothbore gun, better armor than the T-55. Syrian crews trained on them for months. The T-55s would follow in second echelon. Older design, but proven, reliable, numerous. Some tank battalions still had T-54s, and even a few T-34s, 85s in support roles. What the briefing didn't mention: Israeli gunnery training versus Syrian gunnery training. Didn't discuss what happens when you attack prepared defensive positions where the defenders already know every range to every approach. Didn't calculate what Israeli L-7 105mm guns could do to T-62 frontal armor at 2,000 meters. Syrian tankers believed the numbers. More tanks, more guns, better night vision, Soviet advisors saying the plan would work. Some crews had fought in 1967. They remembered Israeli air superiority devastating Syrian armor. This time would be different. Syrian SA-6 missile batteries would create an anti-aircraft umbrella. Soviet doctrine emphasized combined arms, artillery preparation, air support, infantry with anti-tank missiles following behind armor. The confidence extended beyond tank crews. Syrian high command expected not just tactical success, but strategic breakthrough. Recapture the Golan Heights, lost in 1967, potentially threaten northern Israel itself. Coordinate with Egyptian offensive in Sinai to force Israel into two-front crisis. October 5th. Briefings emphasize speed. Don't stop for casualties. Don't wait for damaged vehicles. Push through, exploit gaps, keep moving. Israeli defenses would crack under sustained pressure from superior numbers. Tank commanders returned to their units and briefed their crews. Drivers checked fuel. Gunners test-fired weapons. Loaders stacked ammunition. Everyone knew the assault began October 6th at 1:55 p.m., timed to coincide with Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, when Israeli military readiness would be lowest. What none of them knew: they'd be feeding tanks into the same valley for 4 straight days, that the numerical advantage would matter less than terrain and gunnery, that 1,400 tanks would become 900 operational tanks in less than a week. The math Damascus promised looked perfect. The math in the Valley of Tears would prove something else entirely. 1:55 p.m., October 6th, 1973. Syrian artillery batteries opened fire simultaneously across the entire Golan front. Tank crews in forward positions heard the shriek of rockets and shells passing overhead. Hundreds of guns concentrating fire on Israeli positions. Camouflage nets came off the tanks. Syrian armor that had been hidden for days, suddenly visible in staging areas along the Purple Line. The 7th Infantry Division tank battalions started engines. Exhaust smoke mixed with dust and artillery debris. Officers waving forward from tank commanders' hatches. First wave, mine-clearing tanks, and bridge layers. Israeli engineers had dug anti-tank ditches along the border, concrete-lined trenches designed to stop armor. Syrian doctrine called for specialized vehicles to breach these obstacles, while infantry and tanks provided covering fire. The mine clearers hit Israeli mines exactly as planned. Some vehicles destroyed, others damaged. Didn't matter. Syrian infantry dismounted from personnel carriers and ran forward carrying picks and shovels. Under Israeli machine gun fire and tank rounds, they dug earth ramps across the ditches. Enough died doing it that the casualty reports later wouldn't specify numbers, just heavy losses during breach operations. But the breaches opened. Syrian tanks crossed the purple line. Israeli Centurions in prepared positions started killing T-62s and T-55s at 1,800 meters. Syrian crews reported taking fire from hull-down tanks they couldn't see clearly. Didn't matter. More Syrian tanks behind the first wave. They pushed through burning vehicles, crossed the ditches, spread into Israeli-held territory. The southern sector collapsed first. Armored Brigade defending with 76 tanks against hundreds of Syrian vehicles. By nightfall October 6th, the brigade commander, Colonel Yitzhak Ben Shoham, was dead. His deputy killed in separate engagement. Operations officer killed. The brigade effectively ceased to exist as coherent fighting force. Northern sector held better but gave ground. The 7th Armored Brigade, defending between Quneitra and the Jordan Valley, fought from prepared positions, fell back, fought again. Syrian night vision equipment proved its value after sunset. Israeli tanks, without effective night sights, struggled to engage targets they could barely see. Syrian crews using infrared searchlights and thermal sights pressed attacks through darkness. By dawn October 7th, Syrian forces held positions 10 kilometers inside the Golan. Israeli reinforcements were mobilizing, but hadn't arrived in strength. The plan was working. Syrian tank crews passing destroyed Israeli Centurions felt the momentum. This wasn't 1967, when Israeli air power destroyed Syrian armor in open desert. The SA-6 missiles were shooting down Israeli jets, pilots reporting they couldn't provide close air support without prohibitive losses. Syrian infantry with AT-3 Sagar missiles knocked out Israeli tanks at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters. Radio traffic between Syrian units carried confidence. Reports to division headquarters emphasized progress. Purple line breached in multiple sectors, Israeli reserves not yet committed, ammunition and fuel supplies moving forward on schedule. Some Syrian tank companies reported losses, 20%, 30% in initial assaults. Company commanders calculated acceptable. When you start with 7-to-1 advantage, losing one tank for every Israeli tank destroyed still leaves overwhelming superiority. The Golan Heights looked vulnerable. Roads to northern Israel were 20 kilometers away. If Syrian armor broke through the remaining Israeli defensive lines, nothing substantial stood between them and the Jordan River crossings. October 6th ended with Syrian commanders reporting success, casualties higher than hoped, but breakthrough achieved. Israeli defenses disrupted, momentum with attacking forces. What the reports didn't emphasize, most gains came in southern sector, where Armored Brigade had been destroyed. Northern sector, the valley between Tel Hermonit and Booster Ridge, remained in Israeli hands. And the 7th Armored Brigade, though reduced from 100 tanks to maybe 60 operational vehicles, still held the ridgelines. The terrain north of Quneitra forced Syrian armor into a natural bottleneck, not impossible to bypass. You could detour 15 kilometers north or south, but that meant exposing flanks to Israeli positions and adding hours to the advance. Syrian commanders looked at the maps and chose the direct route. The valley itself ran roughly east-west between two ridgelines. Tel Hermonit on the north side, 750 feet elevation. Booster Ridge to the south. Low ground between them maybe 3 kilometers across at the widest point. Narrower in some sections. Israeli Centurions occupied hull-down positions on both ridgelines. Hull-down means the tank sits behind terrain with only the turret exposed. Gun can fire, crew can see approaching threats, but most of the vehicle stays protected behind earth and rock. The Centurion's gun depression, how far the barrel can angle downward, allowed Israeli crews to shoot from behind ridgelines while Syrian return fire hit dirt and stone. Syrian tankers approaching the valley on October 7th could see Israeli positions, thermal signatures from Centurion engines, dust from tanks repositioning. The problem wasn't detection. The problem was suppression. You can't suppress an enemy you can't hit, and Syrian guns couldn't effectively engage targets, mostly hidden behind ridgelines at 2,000-meter ranges. Soviet doctrine emphasized combined arms. Artillery should suppress defenders while armor advanced. Syrian artillery pounded the ridgelines October 7th through October 9th. Hundreds of shells and rockets, some Israeli tanks destroyed by artillery, but hull-down positions survived better than Soviet planners calculated. Centurions took shrapnel damage, lost crew members, kept fighting. Air support should have helped. Syrian MiG-17Es and MiG-21s made strafing runs. Some successful. Israeli tanks burned from airdropped ordnance, but SA-6 missiles that protected Syrian armor also created no-fly zones for Israeli jets, and Syrian aircraft couldn't operate continuously over the valley without prohibitive losses to Israeli air defenses that remained functional despite the ground situation. Night vision gave Syrian forces their best advantage. October 7th after sunset, Syrian tanks pushed attacks to within 30 yards of Israeli positions, close enough that RPG teams destroyed Centurions at point-blank range. Syrian commandos infiltrated between Israeli tanks, knocked out several with handheld weapons. Israeli crews without night-fighting equipment fired at muzzle flashes and thermal signatures they could barely identify, sometimes hitting Syrian armor, sometimes missing in darkness, sometimes shooting at nothing, while Syrian tanks maneuvered around their positions. But dawn exposed Syrian vehicles in the valley. Every morning, October 7th, 8th, and 9th, Israeli gunners found dozens of T-62s and T-55s caught in open ground when sunrise arrived, destroyed them methodically at ranges where Syrian return fire couldn't penetrate Centurion frontal armor. Syrian officers calculated the math each morning. Assault during night using thermal advantage, withdraw damaged vehicles before dawn, count losses, resupply, repeat. October 7th. Approximately 60 Syrian tanks destroyed in northern sector. October 8th. Another 70 destroyed. Israeli forces down to maybe 40 operational tanks total according to Syrian intelligence estimates. The calculation looked sustainable. One more assault breaks them. Syrian 7th Division still had 200-plus operational tanks. The 9th Division could shift forces north if needed. Reserves existed. Israeli reserves were still deploying. Syrian reconnaissance reported Israeli reinforcement columns moving toward Golan, but not yet arrived in strength. October 8th night assault penetrated deepest. Syrian tanks reached Israeli positions, fought at ranges measured in meters, not kilometers, destroyed multiple Centurions, held ground for hours. Then Israeli artillery struck Syrian positions in the valley. Assad Republican Guard attempting to flank through dead ground north of the valley got hit by Israeli counterattack. Syrian supply trains coming forward with ammunition and fuel took casualties from Israeli long-range fire. At 1 a.m. October 9th, Syrian forces withdrew from the ridgelines, trying to evacuate damaged tanks and wounded, leaving more wrecks in the valley. Dawn, October 9th, 1973. Colonel Avigdor Bengal, commanding what remained of the 7th Armored Brigade, counted his operational vehicles, 7 Centurion tanks. Maybe a few more scattered across the sector, maybe not. Radio communications were fragmentary. Battalion commanders dead or wounded. company-level leadership trying to coordinate 3 different units operating on different frequencies. Lieutenant Colonel Avigdor Kahalani's 77th Battalion, call sign Oz 77, had perhaps 11 tanks total if you counted damaged vehicles still firing. The 74th Battalion fought with fewer than half its original strength. The 82nd Battalion existed mostly as stragglers absorbed into other units. Ammunition, 3 to 4 rounds per tank. Some crews scrounging 105mm shells from knocked-out Centurions, driving between wrecks under artillery fire to pull unfired rounds from destroyed vehicles. Fuel running low. No resupply convoys reaching forward positions because Syrian fire controlled the approach roads. Bengal radioed Northern Command requesting permission to withdraw. The brigade couldn't hold another assault. 7 operational tanks against whatever Syrian forces decided to commit. The math didn't work. General Raphael Aiton, commanding Northern Command, asked how long Bengal could hold. Bengal said he didn't know. Maybe hours. Maybe minutes if Syrians attacked in strength. Then the report came. 100 Syrian tanks and APCs moving into the valley. Again, Israeli Air Force reconnaissance photographed the formation. 1 complete Syrian battalion, 38 T-62s and 4 BMP infantry fighting vehicles advancing toward the valley from the northeast. Behind them, more units staging. Syrian command was committing reserves for one more push. At dawn, the artillery started. Heaviest barrage yet. Katyusha rockets and MiG-17 strikes. Syrian crews had learned Israeli positions over 4 days of fighting. They knew which ridgelines to suppress, which approaches Israeli Centurions covered, where the gaps existed. 7 Syrian Me-8 helicopters flew over Israeli positions heading toward Bukata, a town north of the valley. 4 helicopters landed, discharged commando forces, Syrian infantry trying to take Israeli rear areas while armor pushed from the front. Bengal made the calculation every defending commander makes when the numbers stop working. If we withdraw, Syrians control this ridge. If Syrians control this ridge, they control the petroleum road running diagonally across northern Golan. If they control the petroleum road, they reach the Banat Yaakov bridge over the Jordan River. If they reach the bridge, nothing stops them from entering northern Israel. No reserves existed. Israeli reinforcements were still en route. Remnants of the destroyed Barak Brigade had been reorganized into a scratch force, maybe 13 to 15 repaired tanks under Colonel Yossi Ben Hanan, but they were kilometers south dealing with Syrian breakthroughs in that sector. These 7 Centurions were everything standing between Syrian armor and the roads into Israel. Kahalani's radio call went to every tank he could reach. Everyone up on the ramp. Now. The ramp, a section of ridgeline overlooking the valley, where Israeli positions had the best fields of fire. Crews responded slowly. They'd been fighting for 80+ hours. Sleep deprivation, combat stress, watching friends die in burning tanks. Kahalani started moving his Centurion toward the ramp alone. Called again. No response. He crested the hill by himself and found 3 Syrian T-62s at the top, maybe 50 meters away. His gunner fired, destroyed the nearest one. Another Israeli Centurion appeared behind Kahalani's position, knocked out the 2nd T-62. The 3rd Syrian tank aimed at Kahalani's turret, then burst into flames, hit by another Israeli tank, firing from rear of the ramp. Other Centurions finally moving forward, 7 tanks becoming 11, maybe 12 as damaged vehicles with limited ammunition joined the line, Syrian armor filling the valley below them. The Centurion entered British service in 1945, designed to fight German Tigers that had already surrendered. By 1973, it was obsolete by most standards, slower than Soviet tanks, less sophisticated fire control than American M60s, mechanical systems from an earlier generation of armored warfare. Israel acquired Centurions in the 1950s and 1960s, upgraded them constantly, replaced the original 20-pounder gun with the British 7 105mm. Same weapon the Americans put on their M60 Patton, the Germans mounted in their Leopard 1. Israeli designation, Shot or Shot Cal, depending on engine configuration. The L-7 fired armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds that could penetrate T-62 frontal armor at 2,000 meters. Effective range exceeded what Syrian 115mm smoothbore guns could do against Centurion armor. Not dramatically, maybe 300 to 400 meters advantage, but in hull-down defensive fighting, that margin decided engagements. Israeli gunnery training gave the other advantage. Crews drilled constantly on rapid target acquisition, range estimation, first-round hits. The standard, identify target, range, fire, hit within 10 seconds. Syrian training emphasized volume of fire and maneuver. Soviet doctrine trusted numbers and speed over individual marksmanship. Hull-down positioning multiplied the Centurion's strengths. The tank's gun depression, how far the barrel could angle downward, was 10 degrees. Better than most Soviet designs with 4 to 5 degrees depression, meant Israeli crews could position behind ridgelines, expose only the turret, fire downward at approaching targets. Syrian T-62s approaching the valley faced Centurions they could barely see. Thermal signatures visible, muzzle flashes when guns fired, but the tank hulls stayed hidden. Return fire hit earth and rock. Israeli gunners aimed at fully exposed Syrian vehicles silhouetted against the valley floor. The rangefinder on upgraded Centurions gave accurate distance to target. Gunner looks through sight, centers crosshairs on enemy tank, presses button. Optical rangefinder calculates distance, feeds data to gunner's display. Faster and more accurate than estimation methods Syrian crews used. Soviet T-62 advantages existed, but didn't apply to this fight. The T-62 was faster, 50 kilometers per hour road speed versus Centurion's 35. Operational range better. Could travel 650 kilometers on internal fuel versus Centurion's 450. Night vision superior. Infrared searchlights and sights versus Israeli xenon lights. None of that mattered when Syrian tanks attacked prepared positions in daylight across open ground against crews who'd spent days learning every range and angle to every approach. Israeli doctrine emphasized shoot and scoot. Fire from position, immediately reverse behind cover. Relocate 50 to 100 meters. Fire again from different spot on same ridgeline. Syrian gunners targeting one position found the Centurion gone, then took fire from unexpected angle. The Centurion's armor helped. British designers had prioritized protection over speed. Frontal glacis plate and turret could withstand Syrian 115mm hits at ranges beyond 1,000 meters. Not invulnerable, Syrian guns killed Centurions throughout the battle, but survivable enough that damage to tanks often kept fighting. Crew survivability mattered in extended battle. Israeli tankers bailing out of destroyed Centurions could reach other tanks, replace casualties, keep units functional. The all-British crew layout, commander, gunner, loader, driver, matched what Israeli crews trained on for years. By October 9th, Israeli crews knew every Syrian approach into the valley, knew which routes tanks used, where they concentrated, how they maneuvered. 4 days of continuous fighting taught lessons Syrian forces paid for repeatedly. This tank column will approach from grid reference X. They'll be at Y meters when they crest that rise. Fire at that specific point. Syrian tankers faced gunners who'd killed dozens of T-62s from these exact positions. The learning curve only went one direction. October 9th, approximately 11 a.m., Syrian armor in the valley started turning around, not retreating under fire, not tactical withdrawal while engaging, just turning their vehicles and moving east, back toward Syrian lines. Supply trucks that had been moving forward reversed direction. Artillery fire slackened, then stopped. Israeli crews on the ridgelines watched through gun sights, didn't understand what they were seeing. Kahalani radioed Bengal, Syrian forces withdrawing. Bengal didn't believe it, ordered reconnaissance to confirm. The confirmation came from multiple sources. Israeli forward observers reported Syrian tank columns moving away from the valley. Air reconnaissance photographed Syrian forces retreating across the Purple Line. Radio intercepts showed Syrian command traffic, but no tactical coordination. Units asking for orders getting silence. Israeli Centurions cautiously advanced into the valley. Crews expecting ambush, mines, some tactical reason for the withdrawal. What they found was wreckage. T-62s with turrets blown off. T-55s burned to empty hulls. BMPs destroyed by direct fire. Some vehicles abandoned intact. Crews bailed out, left tanks where they died. Others showed damage from multiple hits, evidence of Israeli gunners firing into already destroyed targets to ensure kills. The count took hours. Israeli salvage teams moved through the valley marking vehicles. Destroyed, damaged, recoverable. Photography teams documented everything. Intelligence wanted analysis of Soviet equipment, damage patterns, ammunition performance. Final tally: 260 Syrian tanks confirmed destroyed in the valley itself. Another 240 armored personnel carriers. Some sources later revised the count upward. Depends whether you include vehicles destroyed on approaches to the valley or only those actually inside the killing ground between Hermonit and Booster. Broader accounting across the northern Golan sector. Syria lost over 500 tanks and APCs between October 6th and October 9th. The 7th Infantry Division effectively combat ineffective. The 9th Division withdrawn. Assad Republican Guard units pulled back after failed flanking attempts. Israeli losses in the 7th Armored Brigade: 60 to 80 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair over 4 days. Exact number unclear because some damaged Centurions got repaired and returned to service during the battle. Personnel casualties significant, but records vary. Maybe 100 plus killed or wounded across the brigade. General Eitan radioed Bengal around noon. "You have saved the people of Israel." The statement wasn't exaggeration. If Syrian armor had broken through at the Valley of Tears, northern Israel was exposed. No substantial Israeli forces existed between the Golan and the Jordan Valley towns. Syrian tanks could have reached Israeli population centers before reserves fully deployed. The 7th Armored Brigade pursued Syrian forces but stopped at the anti-tank ditch, marking the original Purple Line. Crews were physically and mentally exhausted. Ammunition nearly gone. Fuel barely sufficient to return to Israeli positions. Israeli forces spent October 10th to 11th consolidating, rearming, preparing counteroffensive. By October 12th, Israeli armor pushed into Syria itself, eventually advancing to within artillery range of Damascus before the ceasefire on October 22nd. Syrian General Staff meeting October 9th made the withdrawal decision. Details emerged from declassified documents years later. Ammunition shortages at forward units, supply line problems, casualties exceeding projections, failure to achieve breakthrough despite committing majority of available armor. What the official Syrian reports don't mention: the psychological impact of losing 500 armored vehicles without breaking Israeli defenses. Tank crews who survived the Valley of Tears reported Israeli gunnery that seemed impossible. First-round hits at maximum range, tanks destroyed before Syrian gunners acquired targets, defensive positions that couldn't be suppressed. Syrian 7th Division officers later admitted they thought they faced 50 to 60 Israeli tanks on October 9th. Learning afterward that maybe a dozen Centurions held the line changed how Syrian commanders viewed the engagement. Numbers said Syria should have won. Terrain and training said otherwise. Syrian General Staff convened October 9th, 1973, while their forces were still withdrawing from the Golan. Minister of Defense Mustafa Tlas presided. Field commanders from the 7th and 9th Infantry Divisions reported via radio. Soviet advisors present, documenting everything for Moscow. The decision? Full withdrawal from advanced positions, consolidate behind the purple line, transition to defensive operations. Officially announced as strategic repositioning to prepared defenses. Reality was simpler. The offensive had failed. Syrian after-action reports cited ammunition shortages. Artillery batteries had fired thousands of rounds over 4 days, depleted stocks faster than supply chains could replace them. Tank companies reported low on main gun ammunition and machine gun belts. Some T-62 crews down to 10 to 15 rounds per vehicle by October 9th. Supply line problems appeared in multiple reports. Israeli artillery and airstrikes interdicted Syrian logistics convoys. Fuel trucks destroyed en route. Ammunition carriers hit before reaching forward units. The roads into the Golan became target ranges for Israeli gunners who knew every approach. Casualty figures exceeded projections. Syrian planning estimated 20 to 30% losses as acceptable for achieving breakthrough. Actual losses in the northern sector approached 40% of committed armor. The 7th Infantry Division reported 186 tanks destroyed or damaged out of approximately 400 committed. The 9th Division, similar percentages. What Syrian official reports don't state directly: underestimation of Israeli defensive capability. Planning documents assumed Israeli forces would fragment under sustained pressure. That numerical superiority would force breakthrough within 48 hours, that Soviet equipment advantages, night vision, newer tanks, more artillery, would prove decisive. None of those assumptions held at the Valley of Tears. Interview fragments exist with Syrian tank officers who fought there. Most stayed anonymous. Syrian government didn't encourage public discussion of the war's failures. One account from a 7th Division Tank Company commander surfaced in the 1990s. Identity withheld, interviewed by military historian doing research on Soviet armor performance. He described Israeli gunnery as impossibly accurate. Syrian crews approaching the valley took fire at ranges where they couldn't effectively return it. T-62 guns theoretically could engage targets at 2,000 meters, but hull-down Centurions firing from prepared positions hit first, hit accurately, destroyed Syrian tanks before Syrian gunners acquired proper aim. The company commander mentioned watching T-62s burn from single shots. Israeli crews weren't firing multiple rounds to ensure kills. They were killing with first shot, moving to next target. Soviet training emphasized volume of fire and maneuver. Israeli training emphasized precision and prepared positions. In the valley, precision won. He admitted the night vision equipment didn't matter as much as Soviet planners thought. Syrian forces using infrared searchlights and thermal sights could see better in darkness. But Israeli crews already knew every firing position, every range to every approach. They'd spent days fighting from the same ridgelines. Syrian tankers were navigating unfamiliar terrain, trying to suppress enemies they couldn't locate precisely. The anonymous officer described October 9th morning when his battalion received withdrawal orders. They'd lost 18 tanks from a 31-tank battalion. Crews were exhausted, some tank commanders arguing they could break through with one more assault. Israeli forces had to be nearly destroyed, just needed final push. Then reconnaissance reported Israeli reinforcements arriving. The scratched-together Armored Brigade remnants under Ben Hanan, maybe 13 to 15 tanks, hitting Syrian southern flank. Syrian command decided the window had closed. Continuation meant feeding remaining armor into the same killing ground that had already consumed 260 tanks. The officer's final comment: "We thought we faced 50, maybe 60 Israeli tanks. After the war we learned, maybe 12 held the ridgeline on October 9th. 12 tanks stopped a division." Syrian official histories don't mention that detail.